Fire Marshal Jack Reid had seen every kind of blaze in 30 years. Kitchen fires, electrical shorts, arson, they all followed the same immutable laws of physics. But standing in apartment 3B, staring at a pile of human ash surrounded by untouched newspapers and a plastic remote control, Reid realized he was looking at something impossible. The victim had been incinerated at 1500 degrees, while nothing else in the room showed a single scorch mark. How do you burn a person without burning anything else? Fire Marshal Jack Reid understood the language of flame. He was its most fluent translator. For 30 years, he had walked through the skeletons of buildings and read the scorch marks like sentences on a page. Fire, for all its chaos and fury, was a creature of habit. It followed rules. It obeyed the laws of physics with a beautiful, terrifying consistency. Give it fuel, give it oxygen, give it heat, and it would tell you its story. Tonight's story was a simple one. A pot of grease left on a stove in a 2-story suburban house. A textbook kitchen fire that had climbed the walls and vented through the second-floor windows. Now, in the aftermath, Reid directed the final mop-up, his calm voice cutting through the hiss of steam and the crackle of cooling embers. He walked the perimeter of the primary burn room, his boots crunching on shattered glass and wet ash. "See this V pattern on the wall, kid?" he said to a young firefighter, pointing with a gloved hand. "Starts low, spreads high. Classic point of origin." He gestured toward the ceiling. "And the joists are gone here, but not over there. That tells you the heat was most intense in this corner. It tells you its path." The younger man nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and respect. To him, it was a ruin. To Reid, it was a diagram. He moved deeper into the blackened heart of the room, pulling a small digital recorder from his pocket. The air was thick with the acrid perfume of burnt plastic, charred wood, and wet plaster. He began his dictation, his voice a low, methodical monotone. Primary ignition appears to be a Class B grease fire. Origin point confirmed at the base of the western wall, consistent with kitchen stove placement. Evidence of rapid spread up the wall, compromising the second floor via the ventilation shaft. He paused, shining his flashlight on a section of the HVAC ducting. Note: inadequate fire stopping in the vent, a code violation. Recommend follow-up with the contractor. He saw the narrative laid bare. A simple mistake, a predictable outcome, a clear chain of cause and effect. There were no mysteries here. In Jack Reid's world, there were no real mysteries at all, only failures of observation, puzzles that hadn't been properly disassembled yet. He clicked off his recorder, satisfied. The story was told, the case all but closed. Driving through the sleeping city, the smell of the fire still clinging to his heavy coat like a ghost, Reid felt the familiar weight of a long shift settle into his bones. The flashing lights were gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of yellow streetlights on wet asphalt. It was almost over. He was thinking of a hot shower and a cold beer when the radio on his dashboard crackled to life, breaking the silence. It wasn't the calm, clipped chatter of the main channel. It was a direct call from dispatch, and the voice was young, hesitant. "Green. Marshal Reid, are you still on shift?" Reid picked up the receiver. "Go for dispatch. We've got a code 1099 at 415 Westmoreland, apartment 3B. A wellness check that went sideways." The dispatcher paused, a beat of uncertainty that put Reid on alert. "Patrol is on scene." "They're saying it's weird, Jack." They requested a marshal respond directly. Weird. It was a word cops used when they didn't have a better one, a placeholder for things that didn't fit the template. Reid sighed, a deep, weary sound. The shower and the beer would have to wait. He felt the familiar pull of duty, the slight annoyance, the curiosity. He made a legal U-turn, the tires hissing on the damp road, and headed downtown, toward an anomaly that was about to shatter his orderly world. The third-floor hallway of the Westmoreland apartment building was stale with the smell of old carpet and boiled cabbage. 2 uniformed officers stood by the open door to 3B, their expressions a mixture of relief at his arrival and a deep, abiding awkwardness. They looked like soldiers guarding a sacred, terrible place. "Marshal," the older one said, nodding. "It's in there." Reid stepped past them into the apartment and stopped dead. The air was thick, stuffy, and held a bizarre, coppery tang, but it wasn't the smell of smoke. The room itself was immaculate, neurotically tidy. Stacks of old newspapers sat on a particle board coffee table, their edges perfectly aligned. The thin polyester curtains hung undisturbed over the window, their cheap floral pattern bathed in the blinking neon from the sign across the street. A low-pile beige rug covered most of the floor, its synthetic fibers showing no signs of distress. Everything was in its place. Everything except the person who lived there. In the precise center of the room, on a patch of exposed hardwood floor, was a neat, almost polite pile of fine, greyish-white ash. It was no larger than a small campfire. Peeking out from the ash were the unmistakable shapes of larger fragments of calcified bone, a piece of what might have been a pelvis, the ball of a femur. Directly above this impossible pyre, the ceiling was coated in a strange, greasy, yellowish-black soot. And just a foot away from the edge of the ash, placed as if its owner had just slipped it off, was a single, fuzzy pink slipper. It was completely, utterly unharmed. Reid felt a cognitive dissonance so profound it was almost physical. His brain, an organ trained for 3 decades to recognize the patterns of fire, was firing error signals like a machine on the verge of collapse. He knelt, his knees protesting, and stared at the scene. He looked at the undisturbed stack of newspapers, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. He looked at the plastic television remote on the end table, not even warped. He looked at the slipper. Fire needed fuel. To create the kind of heat necessary to consume a human body and calcify bone over 1500 degrees Fahrenheit would require a massive amount of energy. The entire apartment should have been a blackened shell. The sprinklers, which he could see nestled in the ceiling, should have gone off. The windows should have shattered. The polyester rug should have melted into a toxic puddle. But nothing had happened. The fire, the impossible fire, had occurred in a self-contained column of reality, touching nothing but its victim. It hadn't just burned. It had focused, it had targeted, it had chosen. This wasn't a diagram. It was a violation. This wasn't a story he could read. It was a sentence written in a language he had never seen before, a language that defied the very laws of his universe. For the first time in his career, Fire Marshal Jack Reid was looking at a complete mystery. Dr. Evans, the city coroner, arrived 20 minutes later. He was a jaded man who'd seen too much and cared too little, and he carried an aura of cynical weariness like a cheap cologne. He gave the scene a cursory glance, his eyes lingering on the pile of ash for no more than 3 seconds before he shrugged. "It's the Wick effect," he announced, his voice flat with the boredom of a man stating the obvious. He didn't even bother to kneel. Happens. Body fat acts like candle wax. The victim's clothes act as the wick. They have a medical episode, drop a cigarette, and they just smolder for hours. It's a low-temperature event, so the fire stays contained. Reid stayed on his haunches, his gaze fixed on the plastic remote control sitting pristine next to the ash pile. A low-temperature event doesn't calcify bone. "Evans," Reid said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That requires temperatures north of 1500 degrees. A fire that hot would have turned this remote to goo. It would have ignited the newspapers and melted that rug. The sprinklers would be on." He stood up and pointed to the ceiling. "And that's soot. It's greasy, adipocere. That is not from a low-temp smolder. It essay from body fat being aerosolized by intense, rapid heat." Evans just sighed, pulling a preliminary report form from his clipboard. He scribbled a few lines and offered it to Reid. "Accidental death. Probable cause. Careless handling of smoking materials. It is a tidy explanation. Plausible. It closes the case. Sign it, Jack." Reid looked at the form. He looked at the smug, tired face of the coroner. Then he looked back at the impossible scene, the ash, the untouched slipper. the violation of every physical law he held sacred. He knew what was expected of him. He was expected to accept the tidy explanation, to file the report, to smooth over the jagged edges of an event that didn't make sense. He was expected to preserve the order, but the evidence in front of him wasn't just an anomaly. It was a lie. And Jack Reid did not sign off on lies. He met the coroner's gaze and slowly, deliberately, put the pen down on the clipboard. "No," he said, "I can see. It is not the right one." Reid's study was his sanctuary, a fortress built of paper, ink, and logic. The walls were lined with heavy textbooks, their spines bearing titles like Cascade Investigation and the dynamics of gaseous combustion. His desk was an island of order in a chaotic world. But now, that order was under siege. Spread across the gleaming mahogany surface were the crime scene photos from apartment 3B. Each image a glaring contradiction to the laws written in the books that surrounded him. He'd spent 2 nights locked in this room, fueled by black coffee and a gnawing frustration. He read and reread the clinical academic papers on the Wick effect. The science was sound in a vacuum. He could visualize the process: a small flame, a smoldering wick of clothing, a slow rendering of subcutaneous fat. It was a plausible theory for a body found in a burned-out chair, surrounded by evidence of a long, slow fire. It was utterly implausible for the scene he had witnessed. He picked up a photo of the untouched plastic remote, then looked at the text describing the sustained temperatures needed for a successful Wick effect. The 2 pieces of information refused to coexist. It was like trying to force the north poles of 2 powerful magnets together. His scientific integrity, the very core of his professional identity, recoiled. With a growl of frustration, he pushed the textbooks aside and turned to his computer. He typed the one phrase he'd been deliberately avoiding, the one that tasted like ash and ignorance in his mouth. Spontaneous human combustion. The screen filled with sensationalist nonsense. Tabloid headlines screamed about curses and demonic possession. Conspiracy forums debated theories involving ball lightning, psychic energy, and vengeful spirits. He scrolled through grainy photos of questionable authenticity and read first-hand accounts dripping with melodrama. His expression was one of pure, undiluted contempt. This was the antithesis of his world, a world of untestable claims and unfalsifiable beliefs. A refuge for those who preferred terrifying fantasies to difficult truths. He wasn't a believer. He was an investigator. And this digital cesspool of superstition offered no evidence, no logic, no answer. It only deepened his resolve to find a rational one, no matter how deeply it was buried. The next day, Reid was in the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the Precinct S evidence locker. The task was mundane, a bureaucratic ritual. He catalogued the personal effects of the victim from apartment 3B, his voice a low monotone as he spoke into his recorder. 1 leather wallet containing $73 in cash and various cards. 1 set of keys. 1 mobile phone, brand irrelevant. He picked up a well-worn copy of a paperback novel that had been on the victim's nightstand. As he opened it to check for any hidden items, a thin piece of cardstock fell out. He bent to pick it up. It wasn't a bookmark. It was a medical appointment card. The facility's name was unfamiliar. Aethelred Diagnostics. The logo was sleek and futuristic, a stylized atom with elegant, orbiting electrons. Below the logo, a handwritten note in neat blue ink read, RCI follow-up. Reid paused, turning the card over in his gloved fingers. RCI. The acronym meant nothing to him, but the card itself felt odd. It didn't fit the profile of a lonely person living in a low-rent apartment. Aethelred Diagnostics sounded expensive, cutting edge. It was another piece of the puzzle, a strange shape that didn't seem to fit anywhere. He dropped it into an evidence bag, sealed it, and logged it with the others. A minor detail, an anomaly, but his gut told him it was something more. His gut led him to the basement. The fire department S archives were a dusty catacomb, a graveyard of forgotten cases stacked to the ceiling in cheap cardboard bankers' boxes. The air was heavy with the smell of decaying paper and time. Reid was on a mission, pulling files for unsolved fire-related deaths, looking for anything that echoed the impossibility of apartment 3B. "What are you doing, Jack?" The voice belonged to Chief Hernandez, who was standing at the end of the aisle, his arms crossed. He looked less like a fire chief and more like a disappointed father. "Chasing shadows on your own time?" Hernandez asked. Reid didn't flinch. He pulled a glossy 8x10 from a file dated 1998 and held it out. "Does this look like a shadow to you, Chief?" The photo showed another small pile of greyish-white ash on a linoleum floor. Another untouched room. Another fuzzy slipper. This one a faded yellow, lying nearby. Hernandez's face tightened. "I remember this one. The press had a field day. The poltergeist pyre, I think they called it. We ruled it undetermined." "This isn't a shadow, Chief," Reid repeated, his voice low and intense. "It's a pattern." Hernandez shook his head, a gesture of finality. "It's a dead end, and you know it. The department can't afford a witch hunt based on your gut. Officially, your case is closed, pending the coroner's report. What you do on your own time is your business, but I want your report on my desk by Monday, the simple one." He turned and walked away, leaving Reid alone in the tomb of cold cases, his warning hanging in the dusty air. The institution had spoken. He was on his own. That night, Reid's study was no longer a fortress. It was a war room. The file for the 1998 victim, a man named Martin Geller, was spread open next to the photos from his current case. He worked with a feverish intensity, cross-referencing, searching for any thread that might connect these two impossible events separated by nearly 2 decades. He went through witness statements, police reports, and autopsy findings. Nothing. He turned to the background check, a dry document detailing a life of quiet obscurity. Martin Geller had been a librarian. No criminal record, no known enemies. Reid was about to give up for the night when he decided to scan the financials one last time. He dug into a thick stack of Geller's old medical insurance statements, his eyes blurring from the tiny print, and then he saw it. It was a single-line item on a statement from 6 months before Geller's death, a payout to a university research hospital for an experimental diagnostic procedure. The authorizing partner listed on the claim was a corporate entity, Aethelred Diagnostics. Reid felt a jolt, a sudden surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of exhaustion. He scrambled across his desk, fumbling for the evidence bag from the locker. He pulled out the appointment card from his new victim and laid it on the desk next to the 20-year-old insurance statement from Martin Geller. 2 different lives, 2 different decades. The same impossible, physics-defying death. And now, the same obscure medical company linking them both. Reid leaned back in his chair, a slow, cold realization dawning on him. The hair on his arms stood on end. This wasn't random. This wasn't paranormal. This was a correlation, a hard, undeniable data point. It's not a coincidence, he thought. It's a lead. The official records request Reid had filed for Aethelred Diagnostics was a shot in the dark, a formal inquiry into a corporation so opaque it barely seemed to exist. He expected it to be stonewalled, buried in corporate legal jargon. He didn't expect his phone to ring 2 days later. A scrambled number, a voice on the other end so quiet it was barely a whisper. "You're asking about Aethelred," the voice said. "Don't, but if you have to, meet me. The Red Arrow Diner. Tomorrow. Noon." The diner was a relic, a capsule of chrome and cracked red vinyl. Reid sat in a booth, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, watching the door. A young woman entered, her eyes darting around the room. She was in her late 20s, dressed in clothes that were meant to be unnoticeable, and she moved with the twitchy, hunted energy of a cornered animal. She slid into the booth opposite him, refusing to meet his gaze, her hands trembling around her own coffee mug. This was Anna. "You're the fire marshal," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the salt shaker. "I am," Reid said gently. "You worked for Aethelred?" She nodded, a quick, jerky motion. "Data entry, low level. I saw things. Patterns. The same patterns you must have seen." She took a shaky breath. "They called them signal loss events. That was the official term. It was for the RCI scanner, resonance cascade imaging. People would have a scan, a new experimental one, and then they'd just be gone. They'd miss their follow-up appointments. Their phone numbers would be disconnected. When I tried to pull their files to follow up, they were quarantined, digitally locked, signal loss." Her voice was trembling, but her eyes, when they finally flickered up to meet his, were filled with a mixture of terror and conviction. "It happened more than once. I started keeping my own list. On paper." She slid a folded piece of paper across the sticky table. It was a list of 3 names, with dates next to them. "They all had RCI scans at Aethelred," Anna whispered, "and they were all reported dead within a month of their procedure. Strange accidents, unexplained medical events." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. "That's all I know. Please, don't contact me again." She was gone before Reid could say another word, leaving him staring at the 3 names, the mystery suddenly having a name of its own. Resonance, Cascade, Imaging. Dr. Lena Hansen, S-Physics lab at the local university, was a chaotic temple of organized thought. Whiteboards were covered in a galaxy of complex equations, and prototypes of strange-looking machines sat on every available surface. Hansen herself was a spark of kinetic energy, her mind moving at a speed that always seemed to leave the rest of the world a few steps behind. Initially, she was deeply skeptical of Reid's story. She listened with a patient, professional condescension as he spoke of impossible fires and corporate conspiracies. "Marshal," she said, an amused smile playing on her lips. "With all due respect, what you're describing sounds like something out of a bad science fiction novel. The laws of thermodynamics are not suggestions." Reid didn't argue. He simply laid his evidence out on her workbench. The crime scene photos from apartment 3B, the file from the 1998 case, the glossy, untouched surfaces next to the piles of calcified ash, the greasy, yellowish soot, the Aethelred connection, the list of names from Anna. As he spoke, Hansen-S expression began to change. The amused smile faded, replaced by a look of intense analytical focus. She leaned in closer, her eyes scanning the photos, the coroner's reports, the name of the technology. "Resonance cascade imaging," she murmured, testing the words. She turned away from him and walked to the largest whiteboard, uncapping a black marker. "Resonance is a real principle," she began, scribbling furiously. "Every object has a natural resonant frequency. If you apply an external frequency that matches it, you can cause it to vibrate with incredible energy. Think of a singer shattering a wine glass." She drew a diagram of a wave. "But you're not talking about vibrating glass. You're talking about a human body." She circled a part of her equation. The human body is nearly 70% water, hydrogen and oxygen. Theoretically, if you could design a machine that could target the specific resonant frequency of the covalent bonds in hydrogen atoms, my God. The marker stopped moving. She turned to face Reid, her eyes wide with a terrifying intellectual dawn. "You wouldn't be burning them, Marshal. You'd be unmaking them. A targeted, resonant frequency could excite the hydrogen atoms in the body S water molecules to a point of catastrophic energy release. Not to boil, but to dissociate, to break their atomic bonds. It would trigger a chain reaction on a subatomic level. The energy required to do that, released instantly, it would vaporize soft tissue and calcify bone. It wouldn't be a fire." Her voice dropped to a whisper, filled with a horrified awe. "It would be a fission event contained in a human body." The silence in the lab was heavier than lead. The impossible had just been given a name and a formula. The horror wasn't that the laws of physics had been broken, it was that they had been weaponized. That night, Reid returned home to a profound sense of unease. The intellectual horror of Hansen's theory had settled deep in his bones. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw it. The front door to his house was slightly ajar. His heart hammered in his chest. He entered cautiously, his senses on high alert. Inside, his meticulously organized study, his fortress of logic, had been expertly, almost politely, tossed. Papers were shuffled, books were slightly askew, but nothing appeared to be broken or stolen. It wasn't a burglary. It was an invasion, a violation. It was a message. And on the center of his desk, placed precisely where the crime scene photos had been, sat a single sleek business card. The minimalist Aethelred Diagnostics logo gleamed under his desk lamp. Below it was a name, embossed in sharp silver letters: Dr. Alistair Finch, CEO. The threat was no longer a shadow. It had a name, and it knew where he lived. The break-in sent a jolt of adrenaline and fear through their investigation. Hansen, her academic curiosity now alloyed with a very real terror, called him an hour later. "Meet me at the university library," she said, her voice strained. "I think I know where to look." He found her in the deep, silent archives, the air smelling of old bindings and dust. She wasn't looking at books. She was hunched over a digital microfilm reader, her face illuminated by its ghostly green glow. "When you deal with science this advanced and this dangerous, it doesn't just spring out of a corporate RD lab," she explained, her fingers flying across the search interface. "It has a history, a dark one." She pulled up a heavily redacted document, a research paper from a 1970s DARPA project. The title alone sent a chill down Reid's spine. Project Chimera, Bio-Resonant Frequency Studies. The paper outlined a theoretical battlefield weapon that could use targeted microwave frequencies to destabilize organic matter from a distance. Most of the text was blacked out, but the appendices were filled with diagrams and equations. Reid watched, mesmerized, as Hansen pointed to a complex string of mathematical proofs in the margins, her finger trembling slightly. They were identical to the ones she had scribbled on her whiteboard just that afternoon. She looked up at him, her face pale in the screen's glow. "They didn't invent it, Jack," she said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "This is it. The origin. They took a military weapon designed to unmake enemy soldiers, and they perfected it. They commercialized it." She gestured at the screen, at the redacted schematics and chillingly detached language. "They disguised it as medicine." Reid stared at the screen, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with sickening clarity. This was bigger than a few deaths. This was bigger than corporate malfeasance. He wasn't just investigating a series of strange accidents. He was uncovering a conspiracy born from the darkest corners of military science, a monster that had been lurking in the shadows for half a century. And it was wearing a lab coat. Knowledge is a dangerous thing. For 30 years, Jack Reid's knowledge of fire had been a shield. Now, his knowledge of Aethelred Diagnostics was a target painted on his back. The discovery of Project Chimera had changed the game. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a conspiracy with a 50-year head start. Hiding was not an option. A man like Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who would disguise a weapon as medicine, didn't leave loose ends. Reid knew he had to face the monster head-on, not in the shadows, but in its own pristine, gleaming lair. The lobby of Aethelred Diagnostics was a cathedral of sterile modernism. White marble floors, glass walls, and minimalist furniture all whispered of immense wealth and untouchable power. Reid walked past a security desk that looked more like a mission control console and flashed his marshal's badge with an authority he no longer felt. He didn't ask to see Dr. Finch. He demanded it. He expected to be told to wait, to be escorted out. Instead, a few minutes later, Dr. Alistair Finch himself emerged from a silent, sliding glass door. He was in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with a warm, grandfatherly smile that didn't reach his cold, intelligent eyes. He radiated an aura of absolute control. He met Reid in the middle of the lobby, a deliberate choice, a public display. This was his territory. "Marshal Reid," Finch began, his voice smooth and charming. "My security chief informed me of your unscheduled visit to your home. I do hope nothing was taken." "Only my patience, Doctor," Reid said, his voice hard. "Project Chimera." Finch's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. Acknowledgement. "Ah, you've been digging in the fossil record. Marshal, your theories are fascinating, truly. They have all the hallmarks of a grand narrative, the delusions of a man who has spent too long smelling smoke and is desperate to find a dragon in the embers." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "Let me be frank. Does resonance cascade imaging exist? Of course, it is the single greatest medical breakthrough of this century. We are on the verge of mapping the human brain so precisely that we can halt the progression of diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's before they even begin. We are on the verge of saving millions of lives." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "If you, a municipal servant with a folder full of ghost stories, interfere with that work because of a few statistically insignificant anomalies, history will not be kind to you. The good of the many, Marshal. Think on that." Finch gave him a final, dismissive nod and turned to leave. He was the embodiment of the establishment gatekeeper, a man who saw human lives as rounding errors on the balance sheet of progress. The conversation was over. The threat had been delivered. Reid met Hansen that night in a dingy, all-night coffee shop that felt a world away from Aethelred's sterile opulence. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and desperation. They were huddled over her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating their grim faces. They were no longer just an investigator and a consultant. They were co-conspirators. "Finch isn't going to stop," Reid said. The CEO's smug, confident face burned into his memory. "He believes his own hype. He thinks he's a savior." "Then we have to stop him," Hansen countered, her voice tight with a new, steely resolve. A message had just come through on an encrypted app from Anna, the terrified data clerk. It was a single file. Hansen opened it. It was the full schedule for the RCI scanner for the next 48 hours. 5 patient names were on the list. A ticking clock. "His arrogance is his weakness," Hansen said, thinking aloud. "He believes he's untouchable. He won't expect us to be bold." She pulled up another file on her screen, a detailed schematic of the Aethelred research wing, which she had acquired through the university's shared research database. Her finger traced a path on the screen. "The RCI chamber itself is a Faraday cage, completely shielded. We can't get a reading from outside," she explained. "But look here." She pointed to a small room adjacent to the main chamber, the observation room. "And that is a maintenance data port. It feeds directly to the central server. The raw diagnostic data from the scanner passes through it." Her eyes lit up with a dangerous idea. If we could get inside during a live scan, if we could plug a portable spectrum analyzer into that port, we could get a real-time recording of the resonant frequency. Not a theory, not a 20-year-old file, undeniable empirical proof. Reid looked at the schematic. He looked at the list of names. He, a man who had spent his life upholding the law, was now planning to break it. But Finch had left him no choice. To expose the truth, they had to use the enemy's own tools: technology, stealth, and a complete disregard for the rules. The following night, the Aethelred facility hummed with a quiet, confident power. Reid and Hansen, dressed in the grey coveralls of a contracted janitorial service, slipped through a service entrance, their hearts pounding in time with the rhythmic clank of their borrowed utility cart. Every shadow seemed to hold a security guard. Every security camera felt like a judgment. They made their way to the research wing, their movements practiced from hours of studying the schematic. The hallway outside the RCI suite was empty, bathed in the cool blue glow of recessed lighting. Reid disabled the camera with a burst of infrared light from a device Hansen had built, and they slipped inside the observation room. It was cold. A large, reinforced window looked into the main chamber, where the RCI machine sat like a sleeping giant. It was a massive, gleaming white torus, humming with latent energy. On the other side of the glass, 2 technicians were helping a frail, elderly woman onto the scanner's platform. She looked nervous, clutching the thin hospital gown around her shoulders. She was one of the names on Anna's list. Reid's jaw tightened. This wasn't an abstract problem anymore. "Okay," Hansen whispered, her voice tense. "They're starting the sequence." She moved quickly to the data port on the wall, pulling her portable spectrum analyzer from their supply bag. The device was no bigger than a tablet. She plugged it in. Inside the chamber, the machine began to spool up, its low hum rising in pitch. A soft blue light filled the torus. The woman on the platform closed her eyes. Hansen's screen, which had been showing a flat line, suddenly exploded with data. A massive, terrifyingly sharp spike erupted across the display, a perfect, clean peak of immense energy, appearing at the exact frequency her theory had predicted. It was the resonant frequency of hydrogen. "Got it!" she breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and vindication. She hit a button to save the recording. They had it, the smoking gun, the dragon in the embers, and then the door to the observation room burst open. 2 large security guards, their faces grim and impassive, filled the doorway. They moved with an unnerving, professional calm. One of them held up a small device, an RF detector that was pointed directly at Hansen's analyzer. Their moment of scientific triumph had lasted less than 10 seconds. They were caught. The lead guard looked at them, not with anger, but with a weary sense of inevitability. He lowered his device and spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Dr. Finch would like a word." There was no struggle. The guards were too efficient, too strong. Reid and Hansen were hauled from the observation room and dragged down a short, sterile hallway into the main RCI control room. It was the nerve center of the entire facility, a semicircular chamber dominated by a wall of glowing monitors displaying incomprehensible streams of data. And in the center of it all, standing like a conductor before his orchestra, was Dr. Alastair Finch. The facility was in lockdown. Heavy steel doors had sealed the room. Finch gestured to one of the central monitors. It showed a live feed of the elderly woman from the scanner, now tucked into a bed in a recovery room, sipping a cup of tea. She was safe. She was fine. "You see, Marshal? No monster, just progress," Finch said, his voice calm and reasonable. He sounded like a patient teacher correcting a promising but misguided student. He held Hansen-S spectrum analyzer in his hand, looking at the damning graph on its screen with something like academic curiosity. "This signal loss phenomenon you're so concerned about, it is rare. A 1 in 1,000 glitch in the resonant field calibration. A statistical anomaly we are working tirelessly to resolve. I will not let you, or anyone, destroy decades of life-saving work because of a rounding error." He placed the analyzer on a console and looked at Reid, his expression hardening. The mask of the benevolent scientist fell away, revealing the cold pragmatist beneath. "You believe you're on the side of the angels, Marshal, but all you will accomplish is the death of hope for millions, the good of the many." He turned to one of the guards, his voice dropping, becoming flat and clinical. "Wipe their data." And them, the finality in his voice was absolute. This was it, the end of the line. But as the 2 guards began to advance, Reid thought of the simple, physical laws he'd built his life on. Finch understood the complexities of subatomic physics, but he had forgotten the basics. He had forgotten how easily a complex system can be broken by a simple, blunt force. Reid, whose hand was in his pocket, made sure his phone was still recording the entire exchange. As the first guard reached for him, Reid moved. It wasn't the move of a brawler, but of an expert who understood emergency systems. He lunged sideways, not at the guards, but at the wall. With a sharp crack, his fist shattered the glass of a small red fire alarm box. Immediately, the room exploded with noise and light. A deafening alarm blared, and strobe lights began to flash, turning the scene into a series of frantic, disjointed still frames. Finch shouted something, but his voice was lost in the din. A moment later, a hiss came from the ceiling, and the room's fire suppression system activated. Heavy sprinklers unleashed a torrent of cold water, dousing the multi-million-dollar servers and control consoles. Sparks flew as the delicate electronics shorted out. Chaos had been unleashed. In that chaos, Reid shoved a stunned guard aside and lunged for a nearby terminal. He pulled Hansen's data drive, the one with the Project Chimera files, from his pocket and jammed it into a USB port. "Lena, now!" he yelled over the blare of the alarm. Hansen, sheltered from the initial spray by a console, was already moving. She pulled out her own phone and tapped the screen, executing a program she had written in the frantic hours before their infiltration. It was a worm designed to hijack a network through an emergency broadcast signal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the wall of monitors, which had been flickering and dying, flashed back to life. But they no longer showed streams of data. Instead, they showed Hansen's graph the terrifying spike of resonant energy, and playing over it, broadcast on a loop, was the audio from Reid's phone. Finch's cold, clear voice ordering their deaths, admitting to the rounding error that had claimed so many lives. The truth was out. The lobby of Aethelred Diagnostics was a swarm of controlled chaos. Reid's own people, the city's firefighters, moved with practiced efficiency, securing the building while police officers placed a stunned and soaking wet Dr. Finch into handcuffs. His guards were already secured. On every screen in the gleaming lobby, and now, on the news channels picking up the leaked data feed, Hansen's graphs and Finch's recorded confession played on an endless, damning loop. The truth, once unleashed, had become its own chain reaction. Reid and Hansen stood off to the side, wrapped in coarse fire blankets, watching the empire crumble. Reid's gaze drifted past the flashing lights, toward the hallway that led to the RCI suite. He could almost feel the presence of the machine, now silent and powerless. It was a monument to both the brilliance and the terrifying arrogance of science, a reminder that the ability to do a thing is never a justification for doing it. Weeks later, Jack Reid sat at his desk in his quiet office. The world had moved on. Aethelred Diagnostics was shuttered, its assets frozen pending a dozen federal investigations. The news cycle had found new monsters to chase. But for Reid, the work was just ending. He picked up a pen and pulled a fresh report toward him. It was the final, amended file for the victim from apartment 3B, the woman who had started it all. He uncapped the pen, and in the box for cause of death, he wrote the new, hard-won truth: catastrophic biological fission via induced resonant cascade, a new term for a new man-made horror. He signed the bottom of the report and closed the file. The case was officially closed. He looked out the window at the city, the familiar grid of streets and buildings that had once seemed so solid, so understandable. The easy certainty he had once possessed was gone, replaced by something heavier, something more profound. He had not surrendered to superstition. He had used his own rigorous skepticism to challenge a flawed scientific dogma. He had learned that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that break the laws of nature, but the ones that exploit them. His world was no longer governed by a handful of immutable laws, but by the quiet, unsettling wisdom that the frontier of knowledge is always expanding, and there are always new dragons lurking just beyond the edge of the map. What's so fascinating about a story like this is how it plays with our fears. For centuries, the idea of spontaneous human combustion has been the ultimate supernatural horror, a mystery that defies all the known rules of science. suggesting a world haunted by forces beyond our control. It is a chillingly ancient kind of fear. But this story pulls off a clever reversal. It gives us a scientific explanation, but instead of providing comfort, it delivers a far deeper and more modern kind of dread. The monster isn't a demon or a poltergeist. It's a man in a lab coat, a corrupted idealist who calls a human life a rounding error. The horror isn't that the laws of physics were broken, but that they were weaponized and disguised as progress. It makes you wonder about the nature of explanation. We seek scientific answers to feel safe, to put chaos back in its box. But what happens when the answer is more terrifying than the superstition it replaces? The story suggests that maybe we're more comfortable with the idea of ancient curses than we are with the cold, calculated reality of human ambition and the dark potential of the technologies we create. So here's my question for you. Which is the greater horror? An ancient supernatural evil we can't explain, or a modern scientific one that we can? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.